Good morning, everyone. And on behalf of DLA Piper, welcome to the Reimagining Retail 2021 virtual event. My name's Chloe Forster, the UK sector lead for consumer goods, food and retail, and a partner at DLA Piper focusing on strategic sourcing, digital transformation and commercial contracts, with each of these areas being highly relevant to today's discussion. We believe that to advise retail clients effectively, we need intimate knowledge of the sector, including a sharp understanding of developing trends and the key issues that retail businesses face. We use our extensive industry experience and strategic alliances with key players in the industry to ensure that we're always at the forefront of developments so we can offer our clients insight in a swiftly evolving and complex environment. I'd like to welcome everyone today who's joined us this morning. I think it's fair to say that at the beginning of the year, the retail sector was already facing its fair share of challenges, but none of us could have predicted the significant parts of the sector would be forced to operate within strict restrictions and lockdown closures, impacting on revenue, thousands of employees, and resulting in a high number of high-profile business failures. As we move forward into 2021, particularly in light of yesterday's announcements regarding lockdown and the need to adapt to changing circumstances, those involved in the sector will want to innovate and plan for the future. Therefore, I'm delighted to welcome our expert panel, who will talk about the factors affecting the retail sector in 2021 and beyond, whilst exploring the opportunities that the sector has to reinvent and reimagine itself. We're honoured to be joined today by Helen Dickinson, Chief Executive of the British Retail Consortium, David Tyler, Chairman of the White Company, Catherine Sargent, Master Tailor and owner of Catherine Sargent Bespoke Tailoring, and Jonathan Ely, Retail Correspondent at the Financial Times. Thank you to each of you for giving up your valuable time to share your insights with us today. I'd also like to introduce Simon Walker, a former Director General to the Institute of Directors and Business Advisor to DLA Piper, who will guide the conversation today. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Chloe, and hello to everybody. I'm delighted to be acting as moderator for today's session. No doubt our time this morning will fly by, and I'm going to ask the panelists to address a number of pertinent themes, leaving enough time towards the end of the session for questions from the audience. And you're invited to submit questions at any stage, either by raising your hand or in writing through the chat function, the little Q&A button at the very bottom of your screens, and we'll do our best to address the themes that are raised throughout the session. But to start off, I'm going to suggest that we look at physical stores and the challenges these face, turning first, if I may, to Helen. Helen, given that it's estimated that 14% of the high street will soon be vacant, what do you think could be done with those spaces in the future?
Hello, everybody. I think it's a great question to start with, Simon, particularly on the day after the Prime Minister's announcement that all of retail can reopen when lockdown ends. So the short term is really clear because it's all about giving retailers of all shapes and sizes the opportunity to deliver for us all as members of the public over what is such a crucial Christmas period. But it is absolutely true that the physical aspects of retailing have been at the front end of the impact of the pandemic. The industry has done a great job rising to the digital challenge, investing in the digital offer. And I think coming back to what that reimagined high street of the future should look like is the first thing is we need to stop characterizing it as physical versus digital or online versus offline or shops versus the internet, and actually really think about the fact that these two channels can join together, and that shops in places and communities around the country have a really bright future in delivering for us all as members of our communities. And that should encompass much more than shopping per se, the whole experience of interacting with retail, as well as housing, care in the community, which is so important, particularly as we've learned in the backdrop with the pandemic, and leisure and culture and things that we have missed so dearly over the past months when we've not been able to go out so much. So reimagining a future where digital and physical come together much more seamlessly, and those spaces include retail, but also have a future that is beyond retail and encompasses a much broader set of offer that is relevant to us at a local level.
Thank you very much indeed. Jonathan Ely from Financial Times, in your recent video for the Financial Times, you made a whole lot of interesting observations, both pre-COVID and post, and at this stage, more recently, on the cause of declining town centres. Of course, looking at Doncaster, which is your hometown. Since the start of the pandemic, there's been a lot more local shopping. Is that going to be enough to save places like Doncaster? And what are your observations?
Well, the short answer is, on its own, no, it's not. It's very encouraging. There's lots of survey evidence that suggests that people are shopping more at local shops, that they value local shops more highly, that they found them extremely useful and convenient during the first lockdown in March, and that they intend to continue patronising them in the future. But all of that alone, I'm afraid, is not going to be enough, because first of all, the sheer amount of vacant retail space in places like Doncaster, where it's close to 1 in 5 shops and almost 20% vacancy rate there, is so large. And also because the causes of decline in town centres are so much more complicated than they're often characterised. The sort of glib explanation for declining town centres is that it's Amazon and business rates, basically. And both of those are contributory factors, but they're not the wider structural picture. The decline of town centres like Doncaster has its roots in all sorts. It's changes in the way we live, the way we travel, the way we work. So, for instance, in the video, which is still on the FT website, thank you for mentioning that, there's a bit where I'm walking around with some officials from the council, and they're showing me a new theatre and a new cinema that the council has built to try and drive footfall and visitor numbers in a certain part of the town. Now, when I was a teenager back in the mists of time, on that same site, there was a College of Higher Education where my mum worked for 20 odd years. There were 2 gigantic coalboard offices. There was a bus station, there was a library, there was a police station and the law courts. The police station and the law courts are still there. The council offices are still there. The college has been relocated to an out-of-town site, and the 2 coalboard buildings have long since ceased to be occupied by the coalboard. So that's thousands and thousands of people who used to work in that town centre 5 days a week are just not there anymore. And I think that's one of the big reasons for declining town centres. It's declining employment in town centres. That's a big part of the problem. The other thing that doesn't get much attention, but I think is quite significant, is that if you go back to the 1970s and 80s particularly, public transport was much more comprehensive than it is now. So South Yorkshire used to have famously the cheapest bus fares in the country, and not surprisingly, people would use buses to travel into the town centre every Saturday to go shopping. People just don't do that anymore. Public transport outside of London has been almost completely dismantled. And as a result, people use cars and they go to places that are convenient for cars. Town centres are not convenient for cars. Out-of-town shopping malls are. And I think that those 2 factors will take years, if not decades, to fully resolve.
But your video, and I do recommend it to everybody, it did show people who were working against the trend. I mean, there was a children's clothing shop called Pud, wasn't there, that seemed to be making it in the centre of town. How do businesses manage that?
That's a particularly good example of the person who runs that business, Fran Bishop, is a social media dynamo, basically, and just is constantly on Facebook, constantly on Twitter, constantly drumming up interest. And also she serves a constituency of shoppers that is also a community. So it's mothers with fairly young children. And so there's a sense of community around that's very valuable in driving engagement. And I think one of the interesting things to come out of that project was that in every town there are these great success stories, and there are these people who are doing really interesting things and being very entrepreneurial, taking big risks and making things happen. But the thing is, the scale of what they're up against means that you always see boarded up shops are the first thing you see. You have to really go looking for these entrepreneurs who are doing great things, which is a shame. I think their light will be less hidden under a bushel in future. But it's an issue at the moment, is that people go to town centres, they see a lot of boarded up shops, they see a retail offering that's focused largely around value, lots of pound shops, lots of discount stores, and they conclude that they're better off going somewhere else, which is a shame. But again, I think it will take some time to get past that.
Thank you. David Tyler, what are your thoughts on turnover and sort of performance-based leases? Do they encourage innovation, and will they ultimately benefit both landlords and retailers? Or do you think there are better ways for landlords and retailers to work together to support the regeneration of the high street?
Well, thanks for asking me the question. Thanks for inviting me, Simon. And I think that there's, excuse me, there's no doubt we need a complete reset of the relationship between retailers and landlords. And we've heard some of the reasons that have caused this huge overcapacity of retail space that we've now got in the UK. It was already crystal clear that was the case before COVID, and the pandemic has exacerbated the situation and made it clearer. And there needs to be a reset because of all this. And again, that's been highlighted, I think, by frankly some pretty bad behaviour, both on the part of retailers, some who have been perfectly profitable through this process and have refused to pay any rent, and also bad behaviour on part of some hard-nosed landlords who've refused to give concessions, even to smaller retailers who are in serious trouble. Clearly, it should be, in the interests of both sides, a middle way, and very often a new way. And I think we are gradually inching towards it in the retail industry. And you've talked about a really important development, which you've seen in many other countries for a very long time, which is that the rent, to a greater or smaller extent, goes up and down dependent on the success of the individual shop. And clearly sales, turnover that you just mentioned, is one way of doing it. Less relevant for all of the purposes of a shop these days, with the impact, of course, of online. So I think, a lot of retailers and landlords are discussing a number of ways of doing this. Typically, there'd be a base rent, which should be a fixed number of thousands of pounds or whatever it happens to be per year or month or whatever the deal is. And on top of, there may be some service charges as well, which may be to some extent fixed. Then on top of that, a variable charge that will go up and down based on various criteria. The most obvious, as I say, is in-store turnover. But you also might want to think about footfall. You might want to think about the digital sales that take place with your brand in that area. Helen's already mentioned about this as a way increasingly retailers are becoming seamless between offline and online. There's the click and collect revenue that's there. Quite a lot of landlords have got upset when retailers have deducted returns that are taken back to their stores from the turnover when these things have been started, even though, of course, the sales started offline. So there is a way, I think, through all of this over a period of time to deal with it. And I think this provides the most likely way forward, this directed to some extent, rent based on success or otherwise. But whatever happens, whatever happens to give effectively landlords a reasonable return on their money, because frankly, if they don't get it, these shops are not going to be maintained and gradually they'll be turned over to other things. To enable landlords to do that, because retailers need them to be retained, making sure the property is in the best possible condition to encourage their consumers to come in. At the same time, landlords have retailers are going to benefit from that situation, because landlords then will feel able to invest in the future. So there is a way through here, I think, but whatever happens, it's going to be tough because there's a huge overcapacity of retail space. And even without COVID, there would have been huge difficulties in actually getting through to the other side, given the impact, above all, of the digital success in recent decades.
Let's stay with innovation, if we may. I mean, this year we've seen some really great innovations with a wider adoption of augmented reality in beauty and home furnishings. For example, Currys' recent announcement to expand their live shopping function. What kind of innovations, David, do you think will help retailers encourage customers not only to spend again, but also to come back into stores to do that combination?
Yeah, I think you've always got to be agile as a retailer. You've always got to change and offer new things. And I think you've seen a lot of progress because of the pressures of COVID in recent months. And you talk about live shopping. Quite a lot of retailers have moved into that space. Currys is a good example. You know, you can have this direct contact with the expertise you want with the person who understands the electronics or whatever. I'm aware, for example, of the success that John Lewis have had, particularly in the nursery area, with new mums and dads wanting to talk to experts on this area. We've done it in the White Company, not to the same extent. It's still in relatively test mode, but it allows you, the customer who wants to know what is the right pillow for you, the right sort of duvet, depending on your particular condition, whether you sleep on your back or your side or whatever, what would actually make sense from you. The sort of conversations that do take place in our stores all the time, we found that they've gone quite well online too, and we'll probably see that expanded in future. Augmented reality, we've been playing with it for a long time. I remember when we opened in Burberry, I was the director of Burberry for many years, we opened the flagship store in Regent Street in London with those magic mirrors, which at the time were very, very new. You had RFID tags on the clothes, and as you approached the mirror, the screen turned into a picture and details about that particular product when you went close to it. And Burberry, for example, in the last few months, have been holding their live stream fashion shows now on Twitch. So you actually feel, if you go on it, that you're experiencing the show as an individual sitting in your study or your lounge, as though you're right there in the fashion show. There's so many other options for innovation, and I think you'll go on seeing a lot of it. Albeit, let's be clear, not everybody is going to be doing this. I think it's already been mentioned by Jonathan, the success of discount shopping, the other huge major trend over the last couple of decades in the UK and elsewhere. And there, frankly, it's being cheap that counts, and finding ways of innovating, getting your costs down, sometimes is more important than some of the things you might otherwise do for your customers.
Well, let me go back to Jonathan for his perspective on that too. Are you seeing these innovations, like augmented reality, making a real difference across the sector, and can they?
I think they can, funnily enough, augment the retail experience and help sort of bolster this kind of idea of an omni-channel experience where the physical and the digital retail works in tandem rather than as sort of separate bits of the same entity. I get dozens of press releases a day about how virtual artificial intelligence and virtual reality and so on is going to save retail and transform profitability in one sector or another. And I have to say, on the whole, I'm fairly skeptical about it all. I think shopping in stores is still fundamentally a fairly social activity. And I think there's no substitute for getting the basics right. Going into a shop, talking to someone who knows what they're talking about and coming out with the thing you went in for. Don't underestimate the power of that as a retail experience. I think some of the more interesting things that I've seen people doing revolve around physical rather than digital activities. So things like how to mix cocktails, how to mix aromatherapy oils, cookery demonstrations, things like that. I think are very sort of good ways. There's traditional ways, of course, they're physical ways of building engagements and interaction. My wife, for her birthday, went on a tour of a gin distillery in London, which was brilliant. They went into the whole history of it and all the sort of science of how it's made, and it was it was thoroughly illuminating experience. I think that sort of thing is really, really good in an era when going to a shop is increasingly going to be a matter of choice rather than necessity. It's this old thing about the difference between buying and shopping. Buying stuff will just be done online or at big out-of-town retail parks where you can just drive up, get what you want and go. Actual shopping, the leisure activity that's sort of shared with friends and is pleasurable, will become increasingly immersive and hands-on.
Catherine, you've got a very different kind of business as a master tailor. I think the first female master tailor in Savile Row. With an independent and personalized business like yours, customer experience is everything. I mean, how have you had to adapt to the way you do business with so much less footfall?
It's certainly been a challenge. I think being a bespoke business and catering for the individual and making things for the individual, we have stepped up our communication with those people, and our customers have obviously been bombarded by every company that's out there trying to get sales. So we're really sort of more sensitive. So the communication is bespoke. So first of all, I sent personal emails out just to see how people were. And then we had a really good response. When we were allowed to open again, it allowed me to communicate with my clients again to say, well, these are the procedures we're put in place. We're making sure it's safe. We did a little video to show what the experience would be like when they come for a fitting in the atelier to gain their confidence that we're taking this very seriously and we want them to come back safely. Then that allowed us to enhance the communication a little bit and be a bit more sympathetic to what their needs might be. So talking about adaptable tailoring pieces, garments that are a bit more versatile, overcoats with it coming into the season. And I've never really done any sort of direct marketing or thought about inspiring my customers to think about the type of things they need. But I, as a business owner, have completely flipped the way I am with them, and we communicate much more because of this COVID, and I'm having to adapt. Yes, it's been really tough, but we're really, really overwhelmed with the lovely responses we've had, and it just shows to me that you can't just flip everything to online. People do want to come back and have that experience when they're able to, and I think having that relationship with those individual people and checking in with them and just seeing how they are. We're available if you need to see us. And then doing like one-on-one Zoom consultations, which is something I've never done before. But obviously we can talk about fabric. I can look at someone's wardrobe. They can show me garments they've got. So, I mean, that's been amazing for me. Who'd have thought I'd be in this situation?
Let's stick with that theme if we can, turning our attention to the online marketplace and the need for agility to adapt to changing customer tastes. But can I also remind everyone about the Q&A button? Questions are starting to come in, so I'm sure we'll have time for some of them. But David, if I can go back to you, COVID-19 has undoubtedly accelerated the trend to e-commerce and online, including amongst a consumer grouping that hasn't been prepared to go in for online in the past. How have your businesses adapted to this, and do you see online shopping levels being sustained into the future?
Yeah, I think, Mark's, that last question is simply yes. I mean, there's been this huge trend, as we all know, of movement online, which has been going on for 2 decades. But there's been a massive blip up this year in the UK, and I think in many other countries too, a discontinuity, if you like. The latest figures I saw from ONS showed that the proportion of shopping that's going on online was 20.1% in February, so 20% basically on the mark, and was 27.5% in September. And that's an extraordinary growth. And I don't think it's going to go down again or grow at anything like the speed again, to be frank, in the future. And many, many people have been converted who weren't previously using online means during this sort of period. And actually part of that, and probably the most significant part, an area I know a lot about, is online grocery. That's gone up from 7% of total grocery shopping at the beginning of the year to about 12.5% today. Again, a massive change. We think what that means, a growth of around 70% for that sector. And I don't think that, for example, is going to go down again because people love the convenience of it. But will e-commerce take 100% of retail spending? Of course it won't. And I was a bit surprised by a survey I think from PwC I saw the other day, which suggested that 88% of shoppers in the UK were going to do all of their Christmas shopping online. Now, I really doubt it. It's not going to be that big, but without question, it will continue to grow. And I agree with what I think Jonathan just said. I mean, human beings are still social creatures. We're social animals. To a great extent, when we want to go shopping, it's a leisure activity. We want to go with family and friends. We want to look at items together, touch them, feel them, smell them, try them on, and so on. And maybe when we're there, go and have a coffee or a meal or go to the cinema. The big day out and so on is all there. And all of that provides emotion. And the one thing about e-commerce, however brilliantly it's done, is it probably doesn't quite have the same appeal to the emotions that you can have from a real shopping experience at the time. So that's all what's going on. I mean, the White Company, you asked specifically about my own company, which I chair these days. Look, it started 25 years ago as a catalogue company, so it's always been in its blood, offline shopping, if you like. The non-store environment is where it started. Today, I feel like before COVID, store shopping did amount to more than half of the total sales. But that's completely changed during COVID. They've had in the business tremendous success online over this sort of period. And the big worries that we've had all the way through the pandemic is, could anything happen to our warehouse? Could we get COVID there? That's been a worry for lots of retailers because so much volume was being pumped through it. But in terms of our business, they've done a great job of expanding capacity in our distribution network, in our warehouse, making things work extremely well, and improving the IT environment that's gone alongside it. And when I talk to retail colleagues in other businesses, I hear the same sort of things. People work really hard to make that shopping experience offline more and more effective to the customer.
Catherine, why do you think the independent sector is weathering the high street storm so much better than some much loved retail names? And what do you think independents have got that they could teach more well-established retailers?
I think, again, it goes back to the relationship and the relationship of trust. People come to me for the expertise that I offer. We're a very unique craft-based business, but it's how we communicate with our clients. And I think having that sort of sensitivity, personalization, sort of treating everybody as individuals is really important. And, I think from my own experience, when I go into a store, I don't want to be sold to. If somebody's interested in solving my problems, that's a different way of looking at it. And I think that's why I talk about my experience when I go in store. And I think some places have amazing online presence and it drives, footfall in store. And I look at all these stores that are empty now, and some are doing really interesting things with windows, for example. That's the opportunity to really excite their customer base. Or if you walk past the store, it just looks closed, and it is closed, but they're not doing anything to really engage. I feel a bit sad about that. So I mean, the first thing I did was change my window display. I mean, who knows who's walking through Mayfair? But I thought, no, seasons, let's think about, tweeds, let's think about that. I'm still thinking what people might need and trying to reach out to those people. And it's a community of customers, a community of businesses in these local areas. I mean, I am in Mayfair. We have a lot of international customers, but unfortunately they're unable to visit us. So it's like, how can, when we are able to welcome them again, how can we make it even better? And I've noticed that a lot of my customers as well are really, really busy people. They don't, I'd have them come for a fitting at the end of the day. It might be something where their PA would ring up and say, you've only got half an hour, you need to fit them and get them out the door. And so I'm used to dealing with people who are juggling all the time their diaries. And I think what this has done, it's given people more time to think about what they need. And actually, it's a welcome relief going and sort of treating yourself or thinking what you might need. And so make that experience pleasurable. And the customers that I have seen when we have been able to open our doors have stayed much longer, chatted much more. They've enjoyed the experience much more. And I've definitely seen that it's a remarkable difference. And I hope that continues and that we don't go back to that sort of rat race that we were in before. So I think there is a real opportunity there for retailers to make their client experience a much better one, a much more personal one.
Jonathan, let me come to you on that as well, about the independent sector and what it can teach more established retailers, but also a reminder to everyone about the Q&A button. Questions are coming in, but you're welcome to pose questions to any of our panelists. Jonathan, what do you say?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We've seen very clear signs during the pandemic that that sort of local independent retailers have been very agile and have pivoted into serving their sort of local customers in very imaginative ways. I think during the pandemic, particularly during the first lockdown, people didn't want to travel long distances. So I think people valued the convenience of local retail. And I think they appreciated the way that local retailers pivoted very quickly into things like local delivery. And they weren't able to do click and collect in the first, but they are able to do it in the second lockdown in England. But that was going on before COVID. I think there's been a fairly long-standing trend over the last 3 or 4 years now, where independents are fewer independent stores are closing than chain stores, and it's almost a reversal of the sort of chainification, if you like, that dominated the sort of 90s and early noughties, when chains used their financial power to basically roll out lots more shops. Having lots of shops is no longer a particular competitive advantage in retail. It used to be said that you needed sort of 300 stores to achieve national dominance. Now you need maybe 40 or 50 plus a decent website. I think also it's become much easier for independent retailers to get online. You no longer have to be a coding expert. You don't have to be able to build your own website. It's very easy to become a merchant selling on eBay. It's very easy to plug into something like Shopify, which gets you online very quickly. It's quite low barriers to entry. And I think that the interesting thing will be what happens with business rates, I think, in the new year. Because under the previous system, before it was sort of suspended for a year for all retailers, small businesses got several advantages through the business rates scheme. There were discounts and there were reliefs for smaller companies. I'm not sure what is going to happen to those once the business rate holiday ends at the end of March next year.
Thank you. Helen, recently the British Retail Consortium has led a plan to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2040. What can retailers more broadly do to address their impact on the environment, especially those who cater for fast fashion?
Well, I think it's been interesting. I mean, we've touched on many of the themes that have come through the pandemic, the theme of sort of pivoting businesses, the theme of digital, the theme of community. And I think another theme that has been one of many conversations against the pandemic backdrop has been that of business purpose, about how businesses can come out of what has been a hideous, well, will be a year by the time hopefully it'll just be a year. How we can build out and come out stronger and better, both as an industry and as a society. And I think climate change is absolutely one of the areas where there is a huge threat, a global threat. It is one of the biggest threats that we all face. And it is also an opportunity for us all to build back better, greener, to move to a place, certainly from a retail industry point of view, where every customer who wants to make a purchase, whether it's in store or online, can do that safe in the knowledge that they're not contributing to climate change. So the initiative that you mentioned is the BRC Climate Action Roadmap. It was launched, a couple of weeks ago. Over 60 retail businesses signed up to support an ambition for the industry as a whole to reach net zero, not by 2050, which is the government's ambition, but by 2040. And the thing that was really exciting and challenging with the roadmap is it includes emissions down the supply chain as well as in businesses' own operations. So the whole idea is that it takes collaboration in order to drive momentum around those big issues. There are huge barriers to overcome, whether it's from a government policy point of view, whether it is from what individual businesses need to do. So creating the forums for people to share what it is that they're doing is part of the backdrop to the roadmap. And, fashion and textiles is a key part of that, because a lot of the contribution to carbon emissions, both particularly down the supply chain, comes from the clothing industry. So really thinking about what the circular economy type principles could and should apply to clothing could and should be. So take back schemes, for example, rental schemes, shifting the consumer behavior off the sort of take, make and sort of dispose model, which is the big driver of emissions. And I think it was interesting, in Germany, apparently 75% of clothing is collected and recycled into everything from new clothes to insulation for houses, whereas in the UK, I mean, the latest data is only for 2017, but I wouldn't be surprised if it hasn't moved that much. The amount of clothing that's collected and recycled is 3%, or certainly was a few years ago. So there is a huge amount of work that both businesses, retailers need to do, and we need to work with government. They need to create the infrastructure, recycling plants, for example. There isn't that infrastructure available here in the UK to be able to facilitate it. So I think it's a real burning platform, and it's a great opportunity for something positive to come out of the backdrop of a pandemic. And I really hope that we can play our part in the BRC, but lots of others to really build momentum around how we can drive that sort of change. It's only 20 years away, so there's plenty of time to be able to do it.
Thank you very much. A final question from me before I move to your questions, and that Q&A button's at the bottom of your screens. It would be remiss not to mention the key challenge of Brexit and necessaries of government interventions. Can I ask all of you, opinions on the impact of Brexit obviously vary, with research from Barclays saying that retailers are actually more resilient than ever, but Burberry's been hitting back at government plans to scrap tax-free shopping, which they say will be very bad for the luxury market. What are your general thoughts on the impact of Brexit for the sector as a whole? What should the government do to support? And do you see any upside? Helen, let me start with you first.
Well, the first and the most important thing that government can do is get a deal. I mean, it's pretty simple. I think everybody's been saying it for many months. If we don't get a deal over the next, literally week, then we could end up with, two or three big effects, which you touched on in your question there. Firstly, the impact of tariffs. So there is no doubt that prices for us all as consumers will rise if our imports from Europe, particularly on food, have and are required to have tariffs on them as they come in. So that's the first and most important thing, is that we don't have tariffs. Secondly, we've got the impact of what happens at our borders, and all the sort of the addition of the checks, the red tape, and this is where what the deal actually looks like will become so critical, because there may be more or less time for some of those new processes and procedures, which there will be some, to be put into place, and we need to have that time to ensure that there aren't, traffic jams at the tunnel or wherever else it might be, and that again would put additional cost into business, which again will feed through to prices for us all as consumers. So the importance of both getting that deal, of retailers ensuring that they're as prepared as they can be. And I think the Burberry example that you gave there is all around, a really sort of narrow decision that government has taken to scrap a scheme a retail scheme for overseas and EU travellers coming into the UK, and it just seems completely counterintuitive, particularly as Catherine was mentioning earlier. Businesses such as hers and so many others, not just in London but around the country, are dependent on overseas tourists, and one hopes once we come through the other side of the pandemic that those tourists can come back to the UK, and we want to incentivize them to do that rather than make it actually less competitive than traveling to another European country. And that's basically what they will do if they do go ahead with the plan as it stands at the moment to scrap the VAT scheme.
David, your thoughts on Brexit and related consequences?
Well, Simon, you've heard me talk about it before. They're pretty unprintable, my thoughts about Brexit. Look, you said at the beginning, opinions vary. Well, frankly, aside from one person I admire, Simon Wilson, who is still in favour of Brexit, I don't know other retailers who are. And the arguments of these people, for me, are all hypothetical and theoretical, which just do not reflect the realities on the ground. You asked, do you see any opportunities? I see no opportunities of any scale. Time and time again, politicians who believe in Brexit tell us there are these opportunities, but they never go on to specify what they are. They talk about bureaucracy in the European Union, but they are creating the most enormous amount of bureaucracy. Even as Helen says, we get a deal, we'll still have grit being put in the whole system. Retailers, indeed the whole country, needs a smooth and frictionless working of transport between the countries of Europe. And we're putting grit in it, as I say, because of all the customs declarations which will have to be made, even if there are no tariffs, the physical checks, the veterinary checks and sanitary checks, that all the food will be there. The talk of 50,000 new customs officials, which the government said are needed, but they're not recruited yet. I think it's laughable. We're told there's going to be less bureaucracy, and that was the reason that we should do this. So sorry if this sounds, like an old speech of an old Remainer, but I think, it is really, really troubling. And if I compare the way this country is being prepared for this major change compared to any business that I've ever been associated with, when they're going through changes, and they make sure there are months of preparation, of training, of changes of IT systems that are then tested, we are going into the unknown, even if we get a deal. And I'm hugely troubled by what is going to happen only 6 weeks' time. And it could be there will be a massive shortage of fresh food in this country. On average, we get 30%. Actually, close to 33% of our food from the European Union in this country. For fresh food, it's much higher. This time of year, it's much higher because also so much of our vegetables and salads and everything come from Southern Europe and so on. So this is extraordinary, and that we're going through this process. And here today, what's the date? November the 24th, is it today? We do not know how things are going to operate on January the 1st and 2nd. So yes, of course, we need a deal this week. We should have had a deal months ago. We should frankly have said that we'll put off the time that we move to the end of transition into the future because of COVID, because actually having these things happening at the same time, even the talks are being affected by COVID. So I'm afraid you know what my view is, Simon, and I'll stop before I take over this programme with extending it any further.
Okay. Catherine, let me move to you, and you must be affected by that question of tax-free shopping being scrapped.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my business is about 2/3 export, so our international client base is substantial, and most of my customers would like to come to the UK, like to come and maybe go on holiday and include a fitting with me as part of it, or have it as part of a business trip. But it certainly does drive them to come. And when they come, they're spending money in our hotels, in our tourist industries, museums, galleries, restaurants. And I think the removal of tax-free shopping is going to be detrimental. And we're coming out of Europe, but Europe is going to have a competitive advantage over us for the international traveller. And I just think it's such a shame, not only as a business owner are we dealing with COVID-19 and the challenges that faces, but also Brexit. So it's just a triple whammy. It's something that we just don't need right now. And I think I'm nervous about telling my customers that they're not going to be able to get their tax-free shopping anymore. And I do think that will stop them from travelling over as frequently, and it will have a negative effect on my business.
Jonathan, an overview of the sector as a whole, Brexit and its consequences.
So first of all, I certainly agree with David that I cannot see really any tangible upside. I have no idea why we're doing this. I mean, I work for the FT, so of course I'm a paid up Metropolitan Elite Remainer, etc., etc. But I've never, even in 2016, I just completely failed to see why we are doing this, what problem we are trying to solve. In retail generally, I think it very much depends whether you are a food retailer or a non-food retailer. I think for food retailers, it is a major headache for the reasons that David and others have outlined. It's going to become much more awkward and burdensome to import fresh food into the country, and that's the case whether we have a deal or not. That having a trade deal will not remove the need for sanitary and phytosanitary checks at borders. Outside of food retail, though, I think it's more of an irritating distraction than an existential threat. So if you are, for instance, if you are a DIY company or an electricals retailer or a fashion retailer, chances are most of your goods that you import come in containers through ports like Southampton or Felixstowe, which are already well set up for dealing with imports from third countries. You have the great advantage in the sense that your products don't actually perish. I mean, they may go out of fashion or become obsolete, but they're not like a lettuce that's going to be rotten this time next week. So I think it's irritating for them rather than existentially threatening. I don't think there will be a massive collapse in consumer confidence as a result of Brexit, unless it goes very, very badly indeed. I think most people respond to things like interest rates, their employment prospects, the amount of money in their bank accounts, rather than what people say on the 10 o'clock news about the state of politics. And I also think that you only need to look at how resilient retail has been through COVID to see that people still do want to spend money on things, irrespective of what might be going on in Westminster. I think also that for retailers in the UK who have operations in other countries, particularly in Europe, it's potentially burdensome, because if you are supplying stores in Europe from warehouses in the UK, then there are potential additional complications. And I know of several apparel retailers, particularly, who are considering building facilities in Europe or have already done so in order to supply that market from within the single market. And also just right down to people, small merchants who sell on Amazon Marketplace and eBay and things like that. Amazon has already advised those people to consider holding stock in a European warehouse to make the process of shipping to European customers easier. It's all very well for them to say that, of course, but if you're a small retailer, that means more inventory, more complication, more working capital tied up in stock. It's another burden at a very difficult time generally for retailers.
Thank you very much indeed. If we can move to the questions that have come in from people who are watching. The first one is, Generation Z wants a mix of experience and online shopping. They're also ethical consumers. How does the high street serve this new segment? Who'd like to take that? Helen, can I try you first, perhaps?
I mean, I think it's a great question, because it brings in, the questions about experience, the questions about digital, the questions about ethics, and I don't know. I suppose I'm going to cheat and just revert back to the fundamentals of retailing. So we have David and Catherine, people who've worked in two different types of businesses, but both have have been really clear on this focus on the customer. So I think the answer that in the context of younger generations, at the end of the day, we are all consumers. So any retailer really needs to understand what it is that their own customers are looking for. And if as a retailer, my customer base is very Generation Z or a particular part of the span of all types of customers, then I've got to be absolutely tuned in to what it is that they are seeking from me as a business, and working out the parts of that that are unique to my retail offer, and making sure that I am delivering against that day in, day out, all of those basic things, and ensuring that I'm relentlessly focused on being able to do that, because the fundamentals of retailing, despite everything that we've talked about, are as they always were. It's about delivering what it is that your customers want, and whether that's Generation Z or any other customer segment, it's as important as it ever was.
Thank you. A question to David Tyler. What's your view on repurposing retail space as affordable housing for the community?
Well, of course, it may well happen. The issue for the owners of property, though, is the value of affordable space for living is much lower than typically retail is. The amount of money you'll get from renting will be much lower than it has been in the past. But frankly, it's going to be inevitable. A lot of retail space is just simply becoming uneconomic for the reasons we've talked about. It'll have to be converted into something, and affordable housing is one of those possibilities. But it means a big reduction in value of the owners of that property, whether that's the pension fund or an individual REIT or whatever it happens to be. But of course, it is one way that the communities can get people into attractive areas where obviously retail has been in the past. But we're going to have to go through some tough decisions if we own property and accept the value is going to be much better in future if it's converted to that sort of use. Others as well.
Helen, are you seeing anything on this question more generally about the conversion of retail to housing?
Excuse me. I think that, coming back to what I was saying about reimagined spaces, I think housing absolutely has a key part to play in that, and that, as we've highlighted throughout the panel, there is this overcapacity of what was historically retail space. So ensuring that the planning system that sits around it facilitates and enables that change of use to happen easily and effectively, I think, is going to be one of the sort of critical success factors in terms of that transition to a different future. But it absolutely should be part of the answer, because, on the one hand, everybody talks about the fact that we have a housing problem across the UK, and on the other, we've got all this excess space in places up and down the country. So surely there must be a way of those two things to actually come together. But as David said, it has big consequences for the investors in that physical space. It also has big consequences for the tax system, because the way that residential property is taxed is very different to the way that commercial property is taxed. So there's a whole load of hurdles to get through. But absolutely, it should be part of the answer, because it's the way to solve that vacancy rate and to provide fill that gap in the housing requirement that is so desperately needed.
Thank you very much for everyone who submitted those questions, and sorry if we haven't had the opportunity to cover them. Particularly thank you to the panel for all your time today, and to Simon as well. Thank you for a really engaging discussion about the challenges and the opportunities that face the entire retail sector. It's been a really invaluable opportunity to draw on our panel's extensive experience and consider together what it means for the retail sector. So thank you all for sharing your insights so candidly. It's been very much appreciated, I'm sure, by everyone who's joined. And thank you too to the audience for joining us today and for your active participation in the questions that we've received. We're going to be hosting roundtable sessions to delve further into the key themes raised today. So for those of you that had questions but didn't get around to submitting them, save them up for those sessions, because we're going to be exploring in greater detail some of these themes with representatives from our sector team. So please do get in touch with me or your usual DLA Piper contact if you'd like to join these. And we'll be sharing the registration information with you shortly so that hopefully you can all join us. Otherwise, it just leaves me to thank everyone again for your time today, and we look forward to speaking again soon. Take care and goodbye.